From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start with a check on the markets, and joining us for that is Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, as I looked at it, it's sort of a war between equities on the one hand, the 10-year yield on the other, with energy a big overhang.
You're certainly right about all of those factors, David. And it's interesting because earlier today, there was a strong risk on field. Now, over just even the last hour, hour and a half, it's a bit more jittery. And it has everything to do with what you were talking about, the intersection between stocks and rates. Because, of course, we have yields climbing on the day. This is bond sell-off. The 10-year yield above 1.28%, the highest it's been in almost a year. So it's a really fine line between the reflation trade that folks want so much that helps out the banks and the energy companies, and the idea that we're having a reopening, vaccine optimism, stimulus, and the prospect of inflation. Because if it's the latter, it causes all sorts of repricing of risk issues. So you see stocks right now jittery. A lot of folks have been wondering what level would actually cause stocks to perhaps move down in a more solid way. The Russell 2000 right now down 0.5%. And then when we bring oil into the picture, oil up not so much at this point. Earlier, it had been above $60 per barrel, its highest level since 2018. This, of course, as we unfortunately have this energy crisis in much of the country, but especially around Texas. But we do have those energy stocks loving the fact that there are potentially refinery problems and that could flow to the bottom line. So it's the banks and energy that are really leading on the day, David.
And price of oil certainly up. Thank you so much to Abigail. As Abigail just said, we do have an energy crisis because of that severe cold in the center of the country, starting in Texas, but now spreading to other states with some 5 million people now without power and rolling blackouts stretching from Texas all the way up to North Dakota. Welcome now the man who, until very recently, was responsible for energy policy in the United States. He's Dan Brouillette. He served as Secretary of Energy under President Trump. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being back with us. Give us your sense. You had that job until very recently. What is this telling us? Is this just a fluke, or is there a more fundamental underlying weakness in the energy grid?
Well, thank you, David. It's great to be back with you. There is a fundamental flaw in our policy and our system here in the United States. As I heard some of your earlier guests discuss, obviously the weather is having an effect on the energy grid, but it's important for us to remember that the weather is not the actual cause of the rolling blackouts that we're seeing across Texas and other parts of the United States. You know, it used to be, David, in years past, we built the utility systems in America to provide energy when people needed it, when they needed it, like right now. And what we've done is we've moved away from that. That's what I just described is known as base load power. We've moved away from that to a more intermittent and, frankly, sometimes less reliable form of energy in the sense of wind and solar. And when people may need the energy like they do today, the wind may not be there and the solar may not be there. So what we've done is we've moved away from that energy security that we used to have here in the United States. And further, David, we've exacerbated the problem by, in some cases, making the base load power, and what I'm speaking to are the pipelines, the natural gas pipelines, dependent upon this intermittent form of energy. So when those windmills didn't blow in West Texas, that means the compressors on those pipelines didn't work, and that natural gas perhaps didn't reach those natural gas utilities in other parts of Texas. So we've got to address this very squarely and have a very honest conversation about renewable energy in America until we can reach the point that we have grid scale storage and battery technologies that allows us to rely on this energy 24/7. It's important that we not put ourselves in a situation where we're dependent upon it.
Well, and Dan, that was going to be my question. How much of this is a storage problem? If we had the storage problem fixed, would it take care of things like solar and wind?
Well, it would, David. That's really the challenge. You know, today, renewable energy does not have the ability to provide what we refer to as grid scale storage or 24/7 storage. So in that sense, it is dependent upon natural gas, nuclear, and coal in certain instances to provide that backup power. But if you've made the backup power also dependent upon the renewable power, you've got a real challenge. And that's what we're seeing in Texas today.
So to what extent is this irrevocable in the sense that coal has become increasingly inefficient monetarily, economically not so feasible? So we have to move away from coal. And if we move away from coal, where are we going?
Well, I think we are going to eventually end up, you know, with very clean forms of energy. It'll be things like fusion, nuclear fusion technologies, smaller nuclear technologies that have zero carbon emissions. We're going to see a lot more solar energy, a lot more wind energy. That's the transition that the world is moving toward. The challenge is if we move there today without baseload power, we're going to continue to see the problems that we're seeing today in Texas. Again, I'll state the point. It's not the weather that's the problem. It's the policy that's the problem.
And what about the grid? Because I also have heard in the last 48 hours some talk about the Texas grid being different from some others, that it's more independent, that it's not as easy to transfer power from Texas outside of Texas to other surrounding states. Is that true?
That is true. Texas is run, the regulator there, it's known as ERCOT. That's the grid manager within Texas. And yes, they are somewhat isolated from the rest of the country. There are instances, for instance, during the hurricane season in Louisiana, where I issued an emergency order to allow electricity to move from Texas to Louisiana to help the good folks in Louisiana recover from the hurricane. But those are unique events. By and large, the ERCOT system, the Texas system, is independent from the rest of the country.
So it sounds like there are some medium or longer term things to do. What could be done right now? I mean, what are they working on, do you think, right now to try to ameliorate this problem?
Well, hopefully what they're doing is restoring the power to these natural gas pipelines so that we can get this baseload power back up and running. That's the most immediate concern that I think people have. We have to get the lights on. We have to get the heat on. And after that, we need to start to look at the U.S. infrastructure and make some real hard decisions about what it is we're going to do and allow us to move natural gas, oil, other important products, electricity in certain cases, from point A to point B. Because as you and I have discussed in the past, David, you know, the issue of production of energy in America, that challenge that we had back in the 70s and 80s, that problem has been solved. Our unique problem today is getting the product to market. So we're going to have an honest conversations with ourselves as Americans about how to do that.
Is it possible on a short-term basis to redeploy some of the energy? One of the things that I've learned because of this crisis is the extent to which Texas in particular relies upon natural gas as opposed to fuel oil for their heating system. Is it possible to redirect some of the natural gas that otherwise would be going to LNG facilities to be exported?
Yes, you can. The question is, you know, can you get those pipelines? Can you get that infrastructure permitted in the United States? Intrastate pipelines in Texas have been somewhat easier to permit than other places around the country. We had a unique problem up in the Northeast where we couldn't get natural gas out of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, an enormous resource for the country. We couldn't get it to the Northeast, which wanted it desperately because the state of New York would not permit a pipeline to allow that gas to travel through its state. It's those types of challenges, David, that we face today in America.
It's not just America, I think, Mr. Secretary. We see problems in Japan. We see problems in Europe because of extreme weather right now and the way it affects energy and the power grid. What can we do to anticipate extreme weather? Because it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier, David. You know, we used to build utility systems in America with security in mind and have it provide energy when people wanted it. I liken this to a national defense. You build an army to protect your people when the enemy attacks. So what you want to do is provide a utility system that provides energy when people want it and need it. What we have today in America is exactly the opposite. When people really need the energy, like today in Texas, our response is to tell them to turn the heat off, turn the lights off. That's exactly the wrong approach to energy policy.
In your opinion, might this phenomenon we're watching right now in Texas and through much of Central United States, might it affect at least the timetable of the Biden administration's plan to go to clean energy?
Well, I hope it does. I hope that there are some lessons that are taken from these types of events. And it's not just Texas. We saw the same thing in California last year as well. Look, I think everybody has the same goal here. Everybody wants clean air. Everybody wants clean water. The question is, how do you do it? And that's an important conversation for the Biden administration to consider. And I think as we look down the road, we'll learn that it's going to be a slower transition than some people anticipate.
So this isn't your job, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. Give some advice to investors right now, investors who are looking at the energy space. What does this tell us, if anything, about what's more investable, what's less investable at the moment?
You're right, David. It's not my job. And if I had a good answer, I would be able to raise these 9 kids in relative ease. It's Look, I think all forms of energy are going to be important to the economy, important to America going forward. So any investment you make in the energy space, be it electric vehicles, be it nuclear power, those are all safe bets in my point of view, because everything that we do in the U.S. economy depends upon the provision of energy.
It may have repercussions for the green energy plans of President Biden. Might it also have repercussions for the infrastructure that he wants to build? I mean, if in fact there is a second wave here, sort of build it better, as he calls it, would there be the potential to really invest substantially in infrastructure that could help us?
Yes, I think there is. I think we ought to look at the electricity grid, for instance. We can move power in certain parts of the country relatively easily. It would be nice to be able to move it from New York to LA or LA to New York in a much more easier fashion. So I think those are important infrastructure questions that we should address, as well as pipeline infrastructure. I know that they've issued some executive orders to suspend activity on things like the Keystone Pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline. In my personal view, I think those are bad decisions. Those energy resources, that oil, that natural gas is going to move to market anyway. It's just going to move on a truck instead of a pipeline. And that's not good for Americans.
Okay, thank you so much for being back with us. Really great to see you again. That's former U.S. Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette. Coming up, we talk with one of the House managers who prosecuted the case against President Trump in the Senate, Congressman Delegate Stacey Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The energy crisis crippling power grids across the U.S. showed few signs of getting better today. Blackouts have left almost 5 million customers without electricity during unprecedented cold weather. Suppliers from Texas to North Dakota are imposing rolling power cuts for the second day to limit demand. On Capitol Hill, Democrats are now turning their attention back to President Biden's priorities. They want to push through his $1.9 trillion stimulus package and get the rest of his cabinet confirmed. The president is unlikely to get everything he wants in the stimulus bill. At least 2 Democratic senators oppose the $15 federal minimum wage provision. U.S. public health advisors are discussing whether to extend the interval between the first and second coronavirus shots. It's a possible strategy for quickly getting protection to more people. So far, U.S. officials have rejected a dose-stretching policy like the UK's that allows up to 12 weeks between shots. A federal lawsuit lodged against President Trump alleges the former president incited the deadly insurrection at the Capitol in January. The suit was filed by Mississippi Congressman Benny Thompson under a Reconstruction-era law. It's known as the Ku Klux Klan Act and comes days after Mr. Trump was acquitted in a Senate impeachment trial. More lawsuits are expected. Mr. Trump's lawyers deny that he incited the riot. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, as Mark just reported, the second impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump came to a close on Saturday with a majority of senators voting to convict, but 10 fewer than the two-thirds majority that is required. Democratic delegate to the House of Representatives Stacey Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands was one of the House managers who prosecuted the case, and we welcome her now to Bloomberg. So, Madam Delegate, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Go back to that trial. I mean, you've got the verdict now. First of all, talk personally. What was it personally for you to help lead the prosecution?
Well, you know, I felt it an honor, and I also felt it was part of my duty as an American to be one of the prosecutors on this case. I really saw it as service to country in the same way that others have served our country. We were defending our democracy. It was our belief. We had a president who the evidence showed overwhelmingly attempted an attempted coup of our democratic process and the peaceful transfer of power for the objective of maintaining power to himself. And so we were there in our minds representing the people of this country to execute the conviction as well as the disqualification of President Donald John Trump.
What do you think it accomplished in the end, now that you look back over the entire experience? I mean, did it serve to hold Mr. Trump accountable for what happened?
While we did not receive the conviction, which in all of our minds was heartbreaking, we went in there believing that we could find him guilty, sufficient for all of the senators to find that. Our objective was to argue to 100 senators, not to just the Democrats, not to just 17 Republicans, but to all of them. And I think in doing so and preparing ourselves that way, we were able to demonstrate to the American people and indeed to the world the truth of who Donald Trump was. The truth that he, in fact, garnered to himself some of the basis frustrations and the hatred that is within some Americans, galvanized them and sent them to the Capitol to execute his desires. And I think that in seeing that, we see that a majority of the senators agreed with us. The American people do as well. And I believe that that is the death knell to any political ambition that he may have in any political office in the future.
It strikes me it wasn't just the 57 senators who voted to convict who agreed with you on the responsibility. We had the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, Republican, stand up at the end and say he is responsible. Mr. Trump is responsible morally and practically for what happened. But I don't feel that we can convict somebody of impeachment after they've left office. Is there anything that can be done to reform that going forward, or is that just the way it breaks?
Well, you know, Mitch McConnell is a master of using Senate procedures to his own benefit, twisting and turning himself, depending on whether he's in power or not, to support whichever argument he's going to make. The reason we did not bring the articles of impeachment over while the president was in office, because Mitch McConnell was in fact the majority leader at the time and would not bring the Senate back into session to receive the impeachment articles. Additionally, at the beginning of the trial, that argument was in fact litigated. Motions were made, arguments were made on both sides, and the majority of senators rejected that argument by the senator. But at the end of the day, he utilized it for his own purposes to admonish the president, but not to convict him, because I believe his objectives were to maintain his minority leadership status and potentially to try, in his mind, to gain the majority in the next election.
Okay, Madam Untitled, I'm going to interrupt us just for a moment here. If you can stay with us, that would be great, because we want to go to the White House, where we have Jen Psaki giving a briefing to the press, and I believe we may hear from the president himself. Let's go to the White House.
Relief programs building on the steps President Biden spoke about a couple of weeks ago. These critical protections were due to expire in March, but as part of today's announcement, the foreclosure moratorium and the mortgage forbearance enrollment window will be extended through June 30th. The administration will also provide up to 6 months of additional mortgage payments to forbearance for borrowers who entered forbearance on or before June 30th, 2020. These actions will bring needed relief to most of the 2.7 million homeowners currently in forbearance and extend forbearance options for nearly 11 million homeowners with government-backed mortgages across the country. It's critical, it remains critical, that Congress pass the American Rescue Plan to deliver more aid to struggling homeowners. As we speak, or maybe a little earlier, depending on when the call wrapped, Jeff Zients had a regular call with a number of governors, our COVID response coordinator, of course, providing them with key updates on our pandemic response, as well as hearing from them about the work they're doing on the ground. As a part of that call, he announced that we're increasing the vaccine supply to 13.5 million doses per week that will go out to states. This is a 57% increase from the amount states received when the president was inaugurated. So since then, obviously, we have announced a couple of increases over the course of time. We're also announcing that we're doubling the supply to our pharmacy program. When we announced that, we said it would be building over time. So today's announcement amounts to 2 million doses going to local pharmacies this week, and this program will expand access in neighborhoods across the country so that people can call and make an appointment and get their shot conveniently and quickly. Eventually, as supply increases, more than 40,000 pharmacy locations nationwide will be providing COVID-19 vaccines through this program. This is a critical part of our plan. Second to last item. Second to last, but certainly not least, we opened healthcare.gov as planned and as we had announced for a special enrollment period until May 15th to provide all Americans the opportunity to sign up for health insurance. They can go to healthcare.gov. Nearly 9 million Americans are eligible for free or subsidized health insurance. Finally, as you know, a brutal Arctic mass impacted the central United States this weekend, bringing freezing rain, sleet, and snow from Texas to the mid-Atlantic. On Saturday night, Texas Governor Greg Abbott requested a federal emergency declaration due to the severe weather storm. Homeland Security Advisor Dr. Liz Sherwood-Randall called Governor Abbott on Sunday to let him know that the president had immediately granted his request to help meet the state's mass care and shelter needs. Yesterday, Liz additionally called the other governors in the storm's path on behalf of the president, including Governor Ivey of Alabama, Governor John Bel Edwards of Louisiana, Governor Laura Kelly of Kansas, Governor Reeves of Mississippi, and Governor Kevin Stitt of Oklahoma. She expressed the president's strong commitment to ensuring that the federal government proactively does everything it can to support state and local officials in preparing for and responding to the events that impact our citizens. We will, of course, continue to monitor the storm's updates in the days ahead. With that, Steve, go ahead.
First, Jen, the president's schedule didn't have a whole lot of official events before he leaves this afternoon. Can you give us a sense of what he's been doing today? And then, does he plan to reach out to those specific governors from those affected states, Governor Abbott and others who have been affected by the storm?
I expect, so let me take the second one first. The president has been kept abreast, as I noted, of the events and been provided updates, regular updates on the storm and the progress, and of course, the emergency declaration. I don't have any calls to read out, but I expect he will be involved personally, and if we have calls that he's making himself, we will provide that information to all of you. In terms of what he's spending his day doing, he's continuing to have meetings with his policy teams and experts about his plans to bring relief to the American people and public, he's remained focused on that today behind the scenes before he travels to Wisconsin for a town hall later this evening.
And just on the vaccine announcement, is there any discussion of this winter weather affecting the vaccine distribution, and what steps is the federal government taking to ensure that there's no spoilage of those vaccines, which have to be kept in those very cold temperatures during shipping and rain delays?
You're right that we monitor, obviously, weather, Mother Nature, and the weather can sometimes impact and requires contingency planning, which is something our team is quite focused on. Our COVID-19 response team is also in close touch with state and local governments across the country. We're monitoring the situation in Texas very closely. Obviously, FEMA is running point on a number of the operational pieces, but while I don't have an update now, it's something we're very mindful of, and we contingency plan to ensure people are getting the doses they need at an appropriate timeline.
Well, on a different topic, Congressman Benny Thompson filed a civil suit against former President Trump. Part of what we expect to be a slew of civil suits against the former president and others involved in the January 6th insurrection. Does President Biden...
Okay, we have been listening, of course, to Jen Psaki. She's the White House spokesperson at the daily briefing, and she really started out talking about the $1.9 trillion stimulus plan. President Biden is on his way out to Milwaukee later today to argue for that plan. At the same time, she also had to talk, of course, about what's going on in Texas and through much of the center of the United States with the energy crisis there. We are fortunate to have still with us Democratic Delegate Stacey Plaskett from the U.S. Virgin Islands. So thank you for your patience, Madam Delegate.
Sure.
First of all, I want to talk about, believe it or not, the extreme cold in the center of the United States. You don't have that in the U.S. Virgin Islands, but you do have natural disasters, perhaps caused by extreme climate. Do you have any thoughts about what the United States needs to do to provide for these extreme climate conditions that seem to be more and more frequent?
Sure. I think, one of the lessons learned after Hurricanes Irma and Maria was the need to have resilience built into infrastructure prior to storms so that individuals and cities, states, municipalities are prepared for the changing climate. In fact, as you saw in Puerto Rico, the need to have a utility system that is weather resistant, that is able to withstand hurricanes. In the Virgin Islands, the lack of funding over multiple years by the federal government really impacted our infrastructure in terms of our schools and our hospitals. So I think Congress, in the instance of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, really did a good job in building into the funding resilience to not only build as it was to rebuild as it was at the time of the storm, but to rebuild as it should have been at the time of the storm. And I think we're going to have to do that throughout the country. I think that's part of, some of the work that we members of Congress are trying to do in the Build Back Better, to put in infrastructure that is resilient, that is able to withstand climate changes. I think that's part of the discussion that's ongoing as we're looking at not just the COVID relief package, but a rebuilding and infrastructure package that the president is putting forward.
It's far too early to really know exactly what happened or what could be done about it. But do you think that we should at least be having a second look at some of the move to renewables? Because some people are saying that's part of the problem. Not that we shouldn't move there, shouldn't get there, but if we go too fast, we don't have the reliability we need.
Well, I think that, for my district in the Virgin Islands, we're looking at multiple forms of energy. Right now, we rely very heavily on fossil fuel, which is the least supportive. We're looking at wind, at solar, even just going to microgrids. I think there needs to be a whole plethora of options that, depending on what the jurisdiction is, what the area and the climate is, that different areas should be looking for. It should not be a one-size-fits-all, and I think that that's what we're going to see across the country as states and governors working with the Biden administration, try and come up with plans that are relevant to the areas of the country.
And Madam Delegate, turn to that question of the stimulus that you referred to and we heard from Jen Psaki about. Give us a sense of the U.S. Virgin Islands, what the needs are there. I mean, it strikes me that you rely on tourism quite a bit. There must not be that much tourism at the moment.
Well, I think that, the COVID pandemic has really peeled back any veneer that has existed and that was, covering anyone's eyes about what is really going on in this country and the have and have-nots. Whether it comes to young children who are unable even to work remotely because their families don't have laptops, don't have broadband, parents who have to go to work during the pandemic, as opposed to those whose families had the means to even create small nuclear pods with tutors in some areas. We've seen that in healthcare workers as well, those individuals who are on the front line. So I think that these are some of the things that we're looking at. How do we get beyond issues of health, economics? How do we bring our children back to school in a safe manner? This is something that we're all working on. We were talking initially about the impeachment trial, but many of us who were managers on the impeachment trial in the evenings and in between presentations were also involved in budget markups for our committees. I, for one, was working on the Ways and Means Committee in between presentations to mark up the bill that President Biden has put forward as a COVID relief package. And I think that we've got to go big in this instance if we're going to get ourselves back on our feet and move this country forward.
Go big, go how fast? Do you have any sense? We heard from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, last week, who said she'd like to get this done by the end of this month. Is that realistic?
I think that's realistic. I know on the House side, we're able to do more than one thing at a time, as demonstrated by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, bringing over managers to do the impeachment trial, while at the same time, chairmen of committees such as Richie Neal of Ways and Means, David Scott on the Agriculture Committee, Mr. Yarmouth, John Yarmouth on budget, working simultaneously as fast as they could to mark up bills to get those in front of the Senate as well.
Yeah, fascinating. What about the $15 minimum wage that is being proposed by the Democrats? And apparently the House is going to try to really push that through. Question whether it can be done in reconciliation. How would that affect the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Well, we have a minimum wage that is pretty close to what is being proposed, so that's not really an issue for us. I think that, if you were to carve out the hospitality for those restaurant workers and others, that's something that we can have. But I think that we're going to negotiate. Democrats will try to work together as much as possible. We represent many, many different constituencies because we are a big tent, going from moderates and blue dogs to the progressives, and we're going to find some middle ground and get this done.
The U.S. Virgin Islands is a long way away from Washington in very, very ways. Give us a sense of what it's like to represent the people of the U.S. Virgin Islands in Washington, in the Congress.
Well, aside from the distance, we really see ourselves as American, even though we are a territory and don't have full voting rights either in the floor of the House or the ability to vote for president. Virgin Islanders raise their hand and are part of the volunteer of our armed forces in greater numbers per capita than anywhere else in the United States. All of the territories are. We consider ourselves full-fledged Americans and want to be a part of this American experience. From Alexander Hamilton Hamilton, coming from the island of St. Croix where I live, drafting our Constitution, to multiple generations of Virgin Islanders being a part of this American experience. We want our voices to be heard, and that's what they've sent me here to do, not just for our voices to be heard, but to demand for equity and equitable treatment by the federal government in how monies and resources and opportunities are disseminated.
Well, it was really good to hear from you today. Really appreciate your time and your patience as we cut away and came back. That is Democratic Delegate Stacey Plaskett, who represents the U.S. Virgin Islands in the House of Representatives. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Coronavirus cases and hospitalizations are dropping dramatically across the United States. That suggests that measures to stop transmission are working, at least for now. Almost 28 million Americans have tested positive. That probably gives them some degree of immunity. And almost 12% have received at least one dose of a vaccine. Plus, data gathered from mobile phones suggests people are being more cautious day to day. The energy crisis crippling Texas's power system keeps spreading. Almost 5 million people across the U.S. have been plunged into darkness. Meanwhile, authorities are fighting to avoid a total collapse of the grid. Homes and businesses from North Dakota to Texas are losing power in the middle of an unprecedented deep freeze. Blackouts are likely to continue throughout today. It is a double first for the World Trade Organization. The WTO named as its leader the first woman and first African. She's tasked in part with restoring trust in the rules-based global trading system. It's been hit by protectionism and the COVID pandemic. Ms. Okonjo-Iweala.
For the first time in the 73 years of GATT and WTO, you are selecting a woman and an African as Director General. This is groundbreaking and positive. I'm grateful for the trust you have in me, not just as a woman and an African, but also in my knowledge, experience, and as some of you have said, courage and passion to work with you to undertake the wide-ranging reforms the WTO needs to reposition itself for the future.
And Ms. Iweala says that her first priority is to make it easier for poorer countries to obtain coronavirus vaccines. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. I want to turn back to that energy crisis, which is sweeping through the center of the country right now. Houston is one of the Texas cities that has been hit hard by the cold and by the power loss from the winter storm hitting the center of the country. Welcome now Bloomberg's Joe Carroll, who's based in Houston. He's our energy editor. So first of all, give us a sense of what's going on in Houston. What's the temperature outside your door?
Oh, it's below 20, which really never happens here. The worst of it was overnight. We got down, I think, 10 degrees or so. It was far worse up in Dallas, which is further north than us and much colder. But we're 3 days into this, and the blackouts are still spreading. So that is it's disheartening to a lot of people, as you can imagine.
So obviously, Joe, you have power right now. Otherwise, we couldn't talk to you. But have you been losing power? Have you been subject personally, or our bureau down there subject to the rolling blackouts?
Residentially, yeah, we've been impacted. A lot of folks have. There's not a lot of rolling going on. Typically, for most folks, if they've lost power, it has stayed off, and there are some exceptions to that. The real threat we're discovering now is not only the cold, but because all the local water utilities rely on electricity to pump water to houses and apartments, they're starting to shut down. So you're seeing more and more folks that have no water.
So do you have any sense of emergency services coming in to try to address both the heat problem and the water problem?
You know, unlike any blackout situation we've ever seen before, this one isn't a matter of electrical lines freezing and poles getting knocked down, say in a hurricane, which typically happens pretty much every summer here. This outage is because there's just not enough power being created at the source, at the generation plants, and so that's a much tougher sort of problem to solve. You can't just send thousands of trucks out to put the poles back up.
So I understand this is really cold for Texas, and if not historic, it's been a long time since it's been this cold. At the same time, we've had more and more extreme weather events across the country and around the world. Was there any anticipation of something like this, that it could happen? Was there any contingency plan?
You know, the forecast got very cold very quickly. The energy regulator here, they convened an emergency meeting at 6:30 on a Friday night to take some emergency measures, which basically said all the natural gas that's being produced, it needs to go to homes and hospitals, schools, that sort of thing, nursing homes. If you're somebody who takes gas and exports it, on a ship, you're going to lose your supplies. So that was when I think a lot of folks got the idea that this was going to be pretty serious.
And were they able to redirect the natural gas, do you know?
They have. Yeah, they've redirected the natural gas. There's just not enough of it. So many of the wells have frozen up. There's just not enough supply coming out of the ground right now.
We talked with Dan Brouillette, the former energy secretary, earlier in this program, and he said part of the problem is the move to renewables has really taken away some of the security in the energy supply, and that's because we don't have the storage yet for example, solar and wind that would allow us to store up the energy. Is that thought to be true down in Houston?
I think a lot of folks in Texas didn't realize how much of the power load has switched away from fossil fuels and over to wind. It's an enormous wind state, and those mills just can't turn when they're covered in ice. And to sort of aggravate the situation, their backup power is almost always natural gas, and so you had this sort of double whammy of the windmills froze and there wasn't any gas to back them up.
Do you have any sense of relief on the way? What's going on with the weather?
We have another ice storm coming tonight. And the school districts around here have just in the last hour extended their closures through at least Thursday. And as I said earlier, the blackouts are still spreading. The numbers are well above 4 million now statewide. They were 2.7 or something like that 24 hours ago. So we still have a ways to go.
Well, our thoughts are really with you and those around you. It's really tough down there, Joe. Thank you so much for being with us. That's Bloomberg's Joe Carroll from Houston. Coming up, how we can prevent the next pandemic, even as we fight to get past this one, from former FDA Commissioner Dr. Mark McClellan. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. COVID cases are falling again, even as vaccination rates rise, racing to keep ahead of variants of the virus. Welcome now, Dr. Mark McClellan. He's director of the Duke Margolis Center. Dr. McClellan earlier served as the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. Doctor, great to have you back with us. I want to talk about the next pandemic, but first let's deal with this one. Where are we on this? We have a long way to go to herd immunity, right?
We have a long way to go, but we are making a lot of progress, David. So over 35 million Americans have gotten at least one vaccination. That's 10% of the population, including a lot of people at higher risk. The availability of vaccines is going to go up. Both Moderna and Pfizer are expected to supply more between now and the end of March, getting up to 100 million doses each and another 100 million each by the end of June. The J&J vaccine is about to be reviewed by the FDA. Public meeting coming up on that with their independent experts on February 26th, and I'm on the J&J board, so just to let you know about that too. That vaccine, if things go well in the public evaluation and the expert evaluation, could also start being available in March. That altogether could get us up to the capacity of vaccinating more than 3 million people per day. That's a big challenge. We're not there yet. We're about at 1.7 million people per day now, but it does suggest we can make more progress. The challenges ahead, as you say, are, number one, we need to keep being vigilant and stay ahead of the variants. Vaccines will help with that. Number two, there are a lot of Americans who are still not yet sure about whether they want to get vaccinated. So we need to keep reaching out to them with accurate information and really engage community leaders and especially the health professionals they trust, and being an even bigger part of this vaccination effort as we get past this first wave of people who really want to get vaccinated. And then we've got to stay ahead of the variants by testing for them, by making sure that our vaccines stay effective, and making sure that our other treatments do as well, like the antibody treatments that are also helping keep people out of the hospital right now. So a long way to go, but some real reasons for optimism about the future in containing what is turning out to be a really difficult virus.
Do we have enough intelligence, if I can call it that, on the variants? We hear about genomic surveillance and the fact that the United States doesn't do as much of that as, for example, the United Kingdom does.
We don't do as much as other parts of the world do. There are 30 plus countries that do more regular routine testing than we do. Now we're getting there. What we should be doing is testing a sample of all of the tests that come back positive. And if we do it at a representative rate all over the country, because these variants, David, are present at different rates in different parts of the country, and they could spread at different rates and may need different response. It's a big and diverse country with high rates right now in places like Southern California, South Florida, much lower elsewhere. This is also a step that we need for a future pandemic. So building in this genomic testing to the routine testing that we do is very feasible today with current diagnostic technologies, and I hope we can get that in place really quickly.
I'm glad you raised the question of future pandemics, because we still have a lot of work to do, as you say, to get past this one. But you've started thinking about what comes next. You've done actually a study with the Healthcare Leadership Council, as well as your organization. Give us a sense of what you've come up with about what we should be doing, what we should learn from this experience and do to provide for the next one.
Well, the good news is that we now have the technologies to identify new pathogens very quickly. We have the technologies to manufacture and develop tests that can detect those variants quickly. And we have the capacities we've seen in this pandemic to develop therapeutics like man-made antibodies against a new threat and vaccines in really unprecedented time. But the challenges are in doing this at scale and in anticipating every single one of the steps that need to be managed. In the United States, this needs to be a public-private collaboration. The Healthcare Leadership Council report that you mentioned focused on several important areas. One is data sharing between the public and private sector, so there is no uncertainty about how much supply is available, so the federal government can guide and allocate and work with private companies to get the diagnostic tests available and where they're needed, or get the PPE, the masks and the emergency supplies, or get the treatments developed at larger scale. Other key components included changing the way that we pay for and support healthcare. Too many healthcare organizations this time around saw the bottom of their revenues fall out because they're paid on a fee-for-service basis for many elective procedures. They saw the revenues fall out, had to lay off staff at the time when we really needed their help with response. We need to move to payment models, and we've seen good examples of this that are much more robust for getting care out of hospitals and into people's homes, using telehealth and support teams more effectively. A lot of the care responses that we've seen in the pandemic, David, but they're not routine, they're not well supported by the way that we pay in healthcare. So those are a couple of examples.
So Doctor, let me ask an overly simplistic question, but from your experience, is the problem that we're not putting enough money into the system, or that we're not putting it in the right places?
I think it's some of both. We really didn't have enough support into pandemic preparedness by the time this pandemic came along. But I think it's also important to recognize that we're in a different era of pandemic response. We have the capacity through synthetic biology and what we know about technologies like genomic sequencing and mRNA for vaccines to have much more rapid response possible. So it's a different way of managing the response, getting the supply chains in place, planning for that public-private collaboration along with enhanced public health preparedness that'll make a difference. And we've also got much better data capacities than we had before to really be able to identify the points of spread much more quickly and plan for effective, well-coordinated responses. So it's some of both.
Doctor, it's always so helpful when you join us. Thank you. That's Dr. Mark McClellan. He's former FDA Commissioner and Duke Margolis Center Director. Coming up, the fight over raising the minimum wage, what the economics teach us, from Arindrajit Dube. Sorry about that, Mr. Dube. He's from UMass Amherst. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Democrats are pressing forward with their quest for a $15 an hour minimum wage, even as political and economic questions are being raised about its viability. To help us understand the economics of the question, welcome now Aaron Dube. He is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. You've done a lot of work on this, pretty definitive work on this. Give us your sense of what the trade-off that's claimed between, on the one hand, raising people above the poverty level, but on the other, losing jobs.
Thanks for having me. So a little over a year ago, I conducted a major review of the evidence for the UK Treasury about what minimum wages do to jobs. Overall, the most up-to-date body of research, in my opinion, points to a relatively limited effect of minimum wages on jobs in U.S., in UK, and other developed economies. At the same time, it significantly increases wages, earnings at the bottom. So overall, I think that ends up lifting people out of poverty and being a relatively good thing.
So the Congressional Budget Office has done more than one study on this, and I've read at least the summaries of them that concludes that, on the one hand, what you said is exactly right. You raise a lot of people out of poverty. On the other hand, you lose jobs. Last estimate I saw was like 1.3 million or 1.4 million if you go to $15 an hour minimum wage across the entire country.
Yeah, so I think sometimes it's hard to interpret what that 1.4 million means, the top line numbers. Is it big? Is it small? The way to think about it is this. The CPO analysis suggests there will be job loss, 1.4 million fewer jobs. At the same time, wage gains are far larger than that. And so as a result, it ends up lifting people out of poverty and actually increasing earnings overall for working people. Having said that, let me also say that I actually think the CBO analysis is more pessimistic than what I found. In my review, I used a somewhat broader set of evidence, and I also paid close attention to some particular data points. And here's going a little bit into the weeds here, but the CBO analysis really is basically uses 11 studies. And what the problem is that some of those studies there's a few studies that find really large job losses. And one of those is this study from University of Washington that looked at Seattle minimum wage. It just turns out that 2019, that study actually was one where they found really large job loss, but then it turned out that it was actually almost certainly incorrect. In fact, a subsequent analysis by the same authors found job loss that was 1/10 as large from the same minimum wage increase, and that was not included in the CBO report. I can go more into the weeds, but I will say that overall, I think that 1.4 million is, almost certainly too large of a job loss, but the overall tenor is that I think minimum wage increases raise wages. There may be some fewer jobs. On the other hand, there's a lot of other ways that actually the economy absorbs the minimum wage increase.
What about a differential effect on larger businesses or medium businesses as opposed to small businesses? One of the things we hear is it might be affordable for some companies, but when you get to the really small businesses, which are hurting right now during this pandemic, they can't afford it.
So I think there's some evidence that the minimum wage increase does lead to reallocation from lower productivity to higher productivity firms, right? So that means that you may have some more workers working at larger businesses than smaller businesses. That's a possible cost. On the other hand, one could also see that as a possible benefit, that you're actually allocating workers to more productive enterprises.
Now, we hear from some executives, like the CEO of Walmart, who says $15 an hour, it makes good sense in some parts of the country, but not across the country because the cost of living varies so much across the country. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's interesting because Walmart has a minimum wage. It's $11 an hour. It actually is the same in all states. And so that's an interesting point because they actually chose a national minimum wage, which was voluntary but was binding exactly the same way. Same is true for Target, which is a $15 minimum wage, exactly the same across all states in the United States. Same is true with Amazon, a $15 minimum wage, the same across every state. So I think there are different pros and cons for having a set wage.
Right.
Here's the way I think about it, that the federal minimum wage is the floor. Beyond that, 30 states currently have minimum wages that exceed that, okay? 40 plus cities have minimum wages that exceed that. My guess is that's going to continue to be the case in the future as well.
Right.
So the question becomes then for us, what floor should we have at the national level?
Right. I want to squeeze just one more in here, and that's the earned income tax credit. Because some people say if the goal is to bring people out of poverty, a better way to do it is the earned income tax credit, because that's a tax on all Americans, not just people who employ other Americans.
Yeah, so I think earned income tax credit is a great policy that should be expanded. I'm glad to see there's proposals out there. Here's the thing. I think the earned income tax credit and the minimum wage are complements. They work well together, not substitutes. Here's a simple reason why. The earned income tax credit actually does a good thing. It encourages people to work.
Right.
But when more people are looking for jobs, it tends to push wages down somewhat. A minimum wage can stop that. This is the way they can play well together.
Well, this is fascinating. Really appreciate having you on. It's great research that you do there. Many thanks to Aaron Dube. He is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and really an authority on the effects of minimum wage from an economic point of view. Coming up, Balance of Power is going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to former Carlyle CEO, now running for governor of Virginia. He is Glenn Youngkin. He says that what they really need is a business executive running that Commonwealth. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.